Hey, good afternoon. Today is, I think it's Wednesday, September 9th, and I want to put up a quick video review of Chapter 1 from American Yelp. If you haven't gotten it already, and I had a few emails questioning, where's the textbook? How do I get it? If you literally Google American Yelp, you'll see it's a open source free textbook for anybody to use. I put up the links, I believe, in the syllabus, and I also think I put the links in a welcome note. It's absolutely free. If you don't really like reading books online, you can order a print copy for relatively, I think, modest money via Amazon and many other of the booksellers that are out there. I found I don't really like reading that much online, so I ordered a copy myself. I actually had to pay. Usually I get them for free by talking to the publisher, and I say, yeah, I'm adopting the book, and I get a free book. So I had to pay myself because I like to look, I'm old school, I like to read a book the old-fashioned way by turning pages. But nonetheless, it's a fairly decent book, and I think students expect to see more than just reading the book and responding to answers, and they want to have a dialogue with me on some level about what it is I think is important in the different chapters. And obviously, if you're like me, like, hey, how am I going to get tested on this? I want to make sure I do pretty well. I try to test on what I consider essential core concepts that come from U.S. history. No secrets here. It's like when I think about people being like you'd be stopped on the street with some reporter with a microphone saying, I want you to tell me this, that, or the other thing and ask you some question to embarrass you. I don't want you to know some obscure fact that you might do well with on a Trivial Pursuit night. I want you to know the basic core concepts, and I want you to know them well. So I urge you to read, reread, ask questions, look at the links in American Yelp that'll link you to other articles that are pretty good. I may occasionally put up YouTube videos, my own little video, and other articles sometimes to augment the material to hopefully make it a little bit of a richer experience. Chapter 1 deals with the early colonization process. We know that European countries were much more advanced in terms of technology, in terms of their ability to manufacture ships that could cross great open seas to navigate the world, not necessarily accurately. We know that for sure because Columbus was way off. But nonetheless, we knew there were some early, there was early Vikings here. Leif Erikson and probably some other different groups probably did touch the North American continent long before Christopher Columbus. But really with Columbus, it really marks in 1492 the huge significant impact on the European world into what we call the New World or the Western continent, not just North America, it's also South America, it's Canada, it's the whole Western continent. 1492, you guys need to know the facts from the book. I'm not going to teach it like high school, like, the Nina, the Pinta de Santa Maria. Columbus is an Italian navigator. He gets Isabel and Ferdinand, the French monarchs, to sponsor a voyage. And what was the voyage for? A lot of people, this is what I do want to make clear, a lot of people think the early push to find the New World or go towards the New World was for religious freedom. That comes much later. Really what it was for is about money. They wanted to make more money through the trade with India and Asia, and the overland route took so many middlemen, for lack of a better way of saying it, and intermediaries that the cost was so expensive, and the economy was flourishing, but yet it was also burdened by this expense to get these things. So because navigation was improving, they said, hey, we're going to find a westward route to India and the Asia to do market trading and to take advantage of it. What's interesting about Columbus, he was not a flat earther. He knew the world was round, and he estimated, and I think the book suggests he was off by 2/3. I've read before it was about half, but nonetheless, he was off by a big margin of where basically the continents were on the planet and the size of the planet. And that's why we call the areas down in the Bahamas and the Caribbean and all those islands down there, that's why they're called the West Indies, because he actually believed he went far enough to make it to these islands off the western part of India. Completely incorrect, right? It's a whole new world. He gets there and he's looking for, again, the westward passage to get to India for trade. But they're obviously looking for anything that will benefit themselves because they get a cut, but also Spain. The government of Spain sponsored this. So they're looking for anything, well, gold, probably some indentured servants, some slavery was involved. Maybe not initially, but it becomes later. Some of these people were definitely put into forms of bondage right on the different islands, Hispaniola and the other Caribbean islands, basically get taken over by these Spanish explorers. That's not where the real horror comes in. That comes in a little bit later. But we know it's exploitive, and that's some of the darker part of history. Sometimes you look at these things in hindsight, and we think of things that we once celebrated, the discovery of what we think of as America by Christopher Columbus, and now it's sometimes looked at as a bit foul because the Native American and Native peoples that were inhabiting the Caribbean islands and North American, Central America, and South America, these people are all basically undone by Europeans. And so it's got a bit of a backlash now in the way we perceive, or some people perceive, this whole European onslaught into the New World. So after Columbus, he always believed he had found the Western Islands off of India. He did not. But he still tried to extract as much gold and wealth from everything he found. And he also subjugated the people. There's no question about that. The people were very violent towards him. He subjugated them because it was in their advantage to do so. They saw them as heathens, as non-Christians, as simple people, and therefore they had a superiority issue right from the start. And due to that kind of prejudice, they subjugated those people. Now, one of the things that we get into when it comes to more North America and in the central part of the country and in South America is what we sometimes refer to as Native American Indians, and they're called Indians because they thought this was India, potentially. They're not a unified bunch necessarily. In the different islands, there would be unified groups, but when you get into the main continent, there was a lot of Native American settlements from the eastern seaboard all the way to the Pacific, and these were not homogenous. They had different views of religion and political ideology and structure within the family, and they often were warring with one another, and the Europeans took advantage of that. They divided and conquered, and we'll get to that chapter later on more of the colonization from Europe. We're only talking about the early exploration really in this first chapter. So when we test on it, you should know the Nita and the Pinta, the Santa Maria. We should know Columbus comes over. He's an Italian navigator, but he's sponsored by the Spanish government to do so. What are they looking for? Westward route to trade with India and Asia. Those are basic things you should have learned from high school, and hopefully you know them. One of the more interesting things that maybe you didn't know that was fascinating is a lot of people thought the reason why the native people in not so much the Caribbean islands, because they were more they worked fairly well, even though they were tortured and murdered and enslaved by the Europeans. There wasn't, it wasn't really a conquering type situation where there was warfare. These people were very peaceful people. But when you get into Central America and into South America, we know there's the Aztecs, which were very, very sophisticated and very, very well organized. There was some real battle, and it wasn't with Columbus. It was with whom? Cortez. These are secondary expeditions that come around a couple of decades after Columbus, and they decimate these people. And how do they do it? It's obviously going to be a test question. Yeah, they do it through superior military skills and tools and military implements. But what's fascinating that the book does explore, and I think other authors do a better job on it, is that the Native American peoples were not a unified bunch. So like anybody else, if I know that the Aztecs under Montezuma are in charge, but I'm in an outlying Native American community that really doesn't like to be under the thumb of Montezuma or the Aztecs, I might well become allied with the European conquerors, because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that's always been sort of the story through all of European conquest of native peoples. Other native peoples have actually participated in it because they saw a bit of a benefit, and it really was a divide and conquer type situation. But what's the real thing that decimated the Native American people? And when you read the book, and it's something I can't overstress, initially it was purely accidental initially. I don't think we had the scientific knowledge about how disease spread, but basically we're two independent ecosystems. Those in Europe were exposed to things like typhoid and smallpox and syphilis, all these different, I can't remember the list, I wrote them down because all the wonderful diseases we had at that time. That came over, the bubonic plague, typhus, influenza, the mumps, measles, all these kind of pandemics already had ravaged Europe over centuries. And those that were surviving were not immune to it necessarily, but they had a certain degree of a immune reaction, and they were likely to survive these diseases. The Native American people in their own ecosystem, they weren't interacting with the Europeans until this huge onslaught happened, and it decimated the population like nothing else. Some estimate that 90% of I should say Americans because it's South American and Central America, but of Native people were killed not through bloodshed or enslavement or anything like that, but really through disease. Later, we'll learn from some of the later chapters that some of the colonists may have intentionally tried to disease Native Americans that were hostile to their goals and interests. One of them is named Lord Jeff, and that's Amherst College. His history is based. They're called the Lord Jeffs. That's their nickname. And Lord Jeff supposedly was an advocate for disseminating blankets with smallpox in them to Native Americans that they viewed as basically in the way in order to decimate their civilization. So we have this early European interaction, and it developed something called the Colombian Exchange, another term you might want to know for the test. This is basically, we're bringing in things like horses and pigs and other things like that were not in existence in the New World. I always thought horses were here in North America for the longest period of time, and there was a period of time where there were probably horses on the North American continent, but I don't know if it was plague or ice age or all these different types of time frames that happened. In terms of 1492, there were no horses in North America, nor pigs, and they were brought over by Europeans, and the native peoples of the Americas greatly benefited from this infusion of a protein-rich diet, and also Europe benefited greatly from the I don't know about tobacco. Economically, maybe tobacco. I don't know. We need some tobacco. Tobacco is probably usually detrimental crop that was brought back to the Americas, although grown significantly in the Caribbean as well. But the tomato, corn, and it really it helped to create a European baby boom, if you will, because of the dietary benefits that they got from the New World. So the Colombian Exchange, named after Columbus, was not entirely detrimental to peoples of the New World that were already here, but it wasn't designed to help them. It was clearly designed to benefit the European financiers, and it did. And it definitely made Europe richer financially and materialistically and dietarily. And not everything was detrimental to the Native American people that came here. We did introduce, again, not me, I wasn't involved, but the Europeans introduced the horse and the pig and other, certainly some technologies that the native peoples of the New World benefited from. But they were obviously subjugated through violence. They were treated as second rate. They were thought of mostly as heathens. And some people in the later wave of expeditions, many of them were religious leaders, and they were trying to convert some of the Native American people. And what's interesting is, especially a lot of the settlers from Spain, when they settled, most of them were men, and they often did start to enter into relationships with Native American, or Native, I should call them American, I keep apologizing for that, but Native peoples, and they would have children that were obviously of mixed lineage, half European, half Native, and those people would develop into one caste. And so they had a caste system in Mexico and in Central America, depending on your ethnic makeup. And the lowest on the prawn, unfortunately, were those that were here first. The natives to the region would be considered the lowest in terms of racial equity and placement. The highest were obviously Spaniards from Spain. And then the next tier down would be those that were the children of a Spanish individual and a native inhabitant. And then people would actually try to mask the sort of the makeup of who they were. The more European they were, the more likely they could rise in society's caste system. It's really unfortunate. So that's why when you think about racial tension, why we study history, because some of the things that we even have today about different treatment of different peoples has historically been rooted in things that have happened 500 years ago. So it's an interesting, sad part of the history that when Europeans came over, they basically dominated the native people here to their benefit and to mostly the native people's detriment, especially the disease. And I think that's the critical aspect that I want to get out of that. There's an interesting article or section of the book about the war that Cortez places on Montezuma and the siege and how he gets after his gold. And he basically crushes the entire Aztec people. We know later that that the Incas down in South America on the west coast of South America, they basically become decimated by European expeditions and settlements and things of that nature. But that's where we start from. We basically start from a history of conquering and dividing in terms of a nation. And it's not always a beautiful history, but it's a truthful one. And not always with ill intent, because sometimes when people have especially strong religious convictions, but also a strong view about their identity in terms of a nation state, and they come over to some other area that seems a bit backwards and simplistic, you almost think you're doing the people a favor by supplementing and replacing their culture for that of your own, and you try to assimilate those, but at a lower caste and in a lower level of acceptance within the community. But it's your community now. You're taking over. It's that sort of, we'll get to a later chapter, this thing called sort of a manifest destiny. We're superior, we're better, and we're going to show it by dominating. And that's a sad part of the history. But that's the first chapter. I think it's a fairly well-written chapter. There's a lot of information I'm not that excited about, meaning that they talk in theory about the different regional groups. Some were agrarian, and they grew the three sisters. They had beans, corn, and squash was their staple of their agrarian diet. But most of them still maintained a certain degree of hunting and gathering, no matter what region they were in. Plains buffalo, anything on the seaboard was related to fish, especially salmon and shellfish. The Wampanoag tribes right down here in southern Massachusetts into Rhode Island and Connecticut. Seafood played a very significant role. But they were all what? They were all one. They weren't all one people. Just because they were native peoples, they weren't of the same necessarily religious sect or political philosophy, or some were constantly moving based upon seasons. Others were in city states that were very, very well designed and very well organized and stratified with specialized skills within them. And some of these came and went long before European settlements ever came here. The Mayan people, for example, are extremely advanced in math and building techniques, and they pretty much disappeared. Probably, they don't know if it's through plague or through drought or something of that kind, but that culture was pretty much gone before the Europeans even got here. But they weren't what? They weren't one unified set of people. And that's sometimes when you think about when there does become conflict between the colonization of Europeans into the New World, why didn't the Native Americans, because they had so many more number, basically just repel them? Because they weren't unified. They're not one individual group. They have many different views, philosophy, and they have tensions between themselves. That's one of the things I want to drive from chapter 1. Once we get to the colonization process, especially I think most important thing is the revolution, because we talk about political ideology and lawmaking and the constitutional crap. That's when we have documentation. That's when we have a record of what was said and what was heard. We don't have a lot of things that are in existence except through archaeological studies and information through oral histories that have been told over time about the different cultures and societies that existed in the Americas prior to colonization. But I don't know how accurate they really are. A lot of it's speculation. But we do know they were here first. We do know that many of them were thriving. And we knew that the European onslaught really, really changed the game entirely, mostly to their detriment. And I'll leave you with that thought, not trying to be negative, but I mean, that's truthful, I hope. Any questions, concerns, or issues that you want to talk about from chapter one, don't be afraid to shoot me an email, a text, give me a call. My office hours are up too. Somebody asked me, how are we going to do that? We're going to do it. Well, I would think during a virtual office hour, you're going to just email me, but if you want to call, you can. Some people say, well, you should put a Zoom up, but if it's office hours, chances are if it's office hour, you don't want to talk to me with a group of people listening in. So maybe you do. I don't know. So I'm not quite sure I'm going to do the Zoom or the Collaborate through Blackboard for my office hours. Keep in touch. Don't be afraid to raise concerns. I do bonehead things all the time. I'll say there's a video up, but I never posted it. Let me know you're missing something. Let me know there's a deadline issue that I screwed up on or I didn't put them up. Never be afraid to reach out. Try to have fun. Let's learn this stuff together as a team. And it should be somewhat of a fun thing, right? I know some of you in U.S. history, because it's an elective, you have to take it. I know you human service majors out there listening to this tape are saying, this is awful. But you'd be surprised how knowing where you're from and how we've become where we're at right now has roots way in the past. And it's good to understand them to better understand some of the things that are actually happening right now in our country stem from all the way back in this era. So don't be afraid to have fun, even if it's something that's not your favorite topic. Talk to you soon.